IVM.
We would like to thank HDFC Life Insurance for supporting this show. HDFC Life Insurance has created an online video series called Behind the Journey with some of the most interesting people from the creative and entertainment industry. It explores the stories that are behind the glitz and glamour of the spotlight and screaming fans. Let's listen to a snippet from the episode featuring comedian Zakir Khan.
It's not like कि मैंने आज यहाँ पे ये पैसे इन्वेस्ट करें तो इसमें तो इतना रिटर्न आया नहीं, अब मुझे नहीं करना. एज आर्टिस्ट होना जो है वो लॉन्ग टर्म गेम है, वो शॉर्ट टर्म गेम नहीं है. आपको उसको कंसिस्टेंटली अप्रोच करना पड़ेगा डे बाय डे एंड फॉर इयर्स.
Long term consistency is essential as it helps an artist grow, and consistent effort helps growth in your finances. You can watch all episodes of Behind the Journey on HDFC Life Insurance YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/HDFC Life. Take control of your personal goals with HDFC Life Insurance's financial solutions. Plan now with HDFC Life Insurance.
Terms and conditions apply. HDFC Life Insurance Company Limited, IRDAI registration number 101.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I am Pranay and today I have with me space nerds Utkarsh and Pranav. So let's get started today, and today's topic is obviously about space and the need for a new space policy. So first of all, let's understand why are we even discussing this. So Pranav, what are the global developments in space in recent years, because of which a lot of people are saying that we have entered into a new space age, right? So what are these developments about?
So this new space age really began in the early 2000s when you had private companies entering into the launch business. Launching a spacecraft and developing a rocket was purely a contract basis where NASA or some other country space agency would contract a company to build a rocket for them. But then we had Elon Musk and others like Jeff Bezos starting to invest heavy number of resources into building private spacecraft. So the first instance is that you had innovation happening in this area, which is one of the most expensive parts of spaceflight, which is your rockets. So first you had the innovation. Second, you had your satellite technology improving, where you had the miniaturization, you had new sensors being put in, and you had greater investment by smaller companies into making satellites cheaper. So instead of having these enormous satellites which go into 3 or 4 tons or even higher, was now being made into a few hundred kilograms. And all these changes culminate together into what becomes of a new space age, where it is not only becoming cheaper to launch your payloads, but your payloads themselves are becoming smaller, much more efficient, highly effective in what functions they can perform, and can be built by smaller companies. So this is broadly the new space age. At the same time, what you're also having is discussions about space mining, which could be a very, very thriving industry in the near future in about 10 years. Because all of these services are going down, because the costs are coming down, space mining will probably become a reality. And under these changes, you have private companies who are really taking this opportunity to build, to innovate and build new things. For example, there are some companies like Rocket Lab, which are building very, very cheap rockets. You have about 15 private launch companies which are targeting different segments of the launch services. For example, you have some launch services like Rocket Lab and Vector, who really want to capture the small satellite industry for the low Earth orbit. And then you have SpaceX, which is aiming for the higher orbits and heavy launch capability.
Okay, so before you go into the details, so broadly a few things, if I may summarize, are one, there is a huge influx of private players in this sector, which is a result of regulatory changes in the policy, basically encouraging private players to do this. And there is a significant drop in the the metric there here used is how much rupees you need to spend or how many dollars you need to spend to get 1 kg of satellite, right? That's the metric. So that has significantly fallen. That's one factor. The second one is geopolitical competition, right? Even the last space age was fueled by this competition between US and Russia, and now it's probably US and China. And the third factor would be a whole bunch of new applications coming in, and the demand for those applications like remote sensing and good camera images for a lot of things, right? So these are the new things. Utkarsh, would you like to add anything on this?
Yeah, I would just want to start with some numbers. So the global space industry is estimated to be valued at $350 billion today, and it is supposed to go up to $550 billion in 2025.
Okay.
India currently is at only $7 billion, which is around 2% of the global space industry.
Oh, okay. Even though we are one of the leaders in this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we are one of the very few countries who have actually landed something on the moon. And we are the leaders in a lot of space activities till now, right? Just some numbers about the budgets. US has a $39 billion space budget. China around $6 billion. Russia $5 billion. And India is at $1.1 billion as of these numbers. But currently this has grown to somewhere around $1.5, $1.7 billion. So at the very outset, ISRO, although has done a credible job of launching satellites, launching private satellites, it's remote sensing satellites, communication satellites, so on and so on. But we are still behind in terms of private sector competition, and there is a lot of untapped capacity and that needs private sector intervention.
Right. So I think there's a good trivia question to throw up here. Which is the entity which has the most number of satellites in space now?
It's the United States. It has over 600
Not
satellites.
United States. As in United States is composed of, now based on what you said, it is composed of private sector players, it is composed of NASA, so which of the entities in this has the most number of satellites? It is planet.com, right? Because it has so many of these nano satellites which are there. Right?
Yes.
So it just illustrates the fact that we have already moved to an era where it's not that only government agencies put objects in space. There are, and the largest number is not by NASA, for example. We would directly assume it would be NASA, but there are smaller satellites, etc., which are now run by private players, and they are now more than what NASA would.
In fact, Elon Musk has also said that SpaceX would launch 40 or 42,000 satellites by 2025 or 2023.
Yeah, that's a Starlink, which will provide high-speed internet from space.
Right. So we are already at the cusp of this change, right? Where there are different players coming in, and that is totally going to change the way the space sector is currently. Traditionally, it has always been seen as, because there's a lot of research required, there's a lot of risk which will be taken, and the gains are not very easily visible. So it was thought of as a classic case where government needs to play a role. But now I think the fundamental thing which has changed is the demand has risen. So there are people actually want some of these satellite imagery and remote sensing. The applications have improved. So because of the change in demand function, I think private players are also getting interested. And India is no exception. There are a lot of private companies in India doing various things in launch and satellites, etc. as well.
In fact, there are around 25 new space startups which have come up in the last 5 years. New space means the companies who do not take the support of the government space agencies or who are not primarily suppliers to ISRO, but actually intend to go out in space and do their businesses independently.
But here's the catch. All this innovation is possible because of government regulatory frameworks. And you spoke about the demand side. Even on the supply side, you have, in countries like the United States and Europe, you have so many private players entering this market because they see that there is a huge demand and they want to be the supply. This period is very limited. It's a very, very small window where you could enter, because once you have the enormous number of supply, you won't have the demand because you already have so many players offering very, very competitive prices. So for India, it's very, very important that our regulatory framework allows for our private companies to enter the space in the very small window that we have.
Okay, so let's get to this question. You began with saying this is a $350 billion and going to go to $550 billion. but India having just a very small portion of it.
Yeah.
Why is that the case then?
So one of the reasons is because we do not have a national space legislation which can actually enable private sector to come in and take up some of the load that ISRO is carrying right now. So there are many reasons that we need a space policy for. We have already talked about capacity and how there's a requirement of private sector to come in. Just as an example, 1/3 of the transponders used for broadcasting satellites are leased from the foreign satellites. So ISRO is not able to provide that. There needs to be an increased access to space. We have already talked about how space is a difficult sector to do business in, and there's a need for government support to actually incentivize and actually build these companies, help these companies to build from the bottom up and become reliable players at the global stage. There are many other requirements which arise out of international space law as well. So India is a signatory of the Outer Space Treaty 1967 and is a member of the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space. So how international treaties work is they define certain directions for sovereign nations. So a person or an private entity's actions is never governed by international space law. It is actually governed by state law. So all these international treaties need to be harmonized into state law by this Indian state. This is one of the reasons that we need a space policy. Other ideas like liability. So if every activity that originates from a country, the liability for a mishappening goes to the country of registration. If I as a private entity launch a rocket into space and if it happens to have an accident and it damages the environment in space, the liability will come on to India, and India is supposed to get its fair share of money from me. So that framework needs to be defined and it needs to be clear so that people know what to expect and how to go about it. One of the ways how this is done in many advanced space nations is there's a calculation of maximum probable loss according to which every space activity is insured before going into space, right? And if there's a mishap or an accident, the insurance pays for that amount, and there are also caps to which insurance is required. Above that, there are indemnification clauses which say that, if 200 million was the insurance required and if the damage causes 500 million, the rest of it the states will cover,
right,
to promote more private action into space activities.
Okay, so we identified that there's an opportunity in space, that sector is changing, and we came to know that India is not one of the leaders in that, even though we have a thriving space program, one of the most successful ones in India. Yeah. So, and you're saying that's why we need a new policy which can enable this. Yeah. So what do we need to do?
So firstly, we need to change the regulatory structure of the space activities in India. Currently, ISRO is a research organization that facilitates scientific research on the frontier space science and technology. It is a service delivery organization which launches satellites into space, maintains satellites, carries on Earth observation activities. It's a regulatory body. So if a private entity wants to come and launch a space object, it will have to take permission from ISRO. And it's a compliance body. It's a licensing body. So ISRO is kind of the be-all and end-all of Indian space industry.
So basically, instead of being one entity doing scientific research, it has taken the burden of doing everything and it has sort of blocked other activities from happening.
It might not have blocked it, but the fact is the incentives here would be very complicated because it's doing the job of everyone, right?
This is problematic on basically two levels. ISRO does not have the capacity to do that, and the mandate of ISRO should be that of a research organization to produce the best of scientific knowledge on space and be a thought leader there. The second, there are some conflicts of interest in this as well, because if ISRO is launching a satellite and ISRO is also regulating and licensing other private players, it is basically both a player and an umpire in the field, right? There is no separation of powers when we look at it from an institutional design perspective. So this needs to be changed. So what we actually recommend is there needs to be an independent regulatory authority called the Space Regulatory Authority of India, which is responsible for multiple things. These things are licensing space objects, be it launch vehicles, be it payloads, or be it spacecrafts, manned space flight, and so on and so forth. It is responsible for laying out best practices, prescriptive best practices for the world, and laying out minimum technical and safety guidelines that every space activity and every space object should follow.
So hang on. So basically, you are attacking the government, essentially saying that the government is not doing enough, and you want to privatize space. Isn't that what you want to do? That's what a lot of people will ask you.
In fact, I would say ISRO is one of the more efficient government organizations, and it has actually brought glory to our nation. And in recent years, there is a lot of interest in what ISRO is doing. What we are trying to say is build a structure which is more enabling so that ISRO can do its job better, as well as private sector can actually come up and thrive in this environment where there is a lot of demand.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is we need to enable ISRO to do the great things it is already doing, and probably it should be doing a lot more.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of other things which are no longer at the cutting edge of space development, like putting a satellite in the remote sensing orbit. I think there are many companies which can do that. Even developing that kind of satellite, there are Indian startups which can do it. So the idea is, how can we leverage both private sector and the government to push our space program forward, right? That delineation and demarcation needs to be done. We are not talking about just get ISRO and private sector, just get government out of this or something like that, right?
Yeah. So basically, everybody operating to the best of their comparative advantages and making space activities in India go the way it should go, right?
Okay. So you said for that you need to have first a space regulatory authority, which is sort of an independent organization. What will this body do? Why do we need it?
So firstly, it will be an independent organization, independent of ISRO. It will license all the space activities that happen out of India. It will be the compliance and monetary body. So basically, if somebody wants to open a spaceport, there needs to be a license that needs to be given by SRAI. However, there'll be regular audits and checks on the spaceport so that they are following all the rules and regulations that have been laid down. So this is something that they have to do. They also have to lay down the regulations and basic rules and guidelines that every space activity should follow. So these are the major functions that SRAI, or the Space Regulatory Authority of India, should do.
Yeah. So conceptually, you are taking out the regulatory role away from ISRO, which you're trying to make it focus on probably on research, right, as a main role. And then this separate regulatory function is carved out into this Space Regulatory Authority of India, much like how TRAI was done for the telecom sector. And this sort of is one umpire which looks at private players and the government player at an equal footing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, they charge licensing fees. Then they, for the authorizations and the licensing they do, basically they are the licensor and the regulator for all the space activities that are arising out of India, as simple as that. We are also proposing another independent judicial body called the Space Dispute Settlement Appellate Tribunal. So this body would comprise of judges on deputation to tackle all the issues related to disputes and space appeals specifically. So this would bring in better turnaround times for space cases. And since space is also a very technical field, not all courts would have the expertise to deal with the appeals that arise out of space disputes and space activities that are inevitably likely to happen when more private players and more players enter into the space. So SDSAT would also tackle with complaints against the SRAI. So if a licensee has a complaint against the SRAI, which is the licensor, about not being treated on an equal footing, about being denied a service or denied a license, they can actually challenge the decision in the SDSAT.
Okay. These are the two main institutional changes you want to bring. So how exactly do you anticipate these helping the private sector?
So firstly, they'll be independent. So they'll lay down their guidelines so that private sector can actually go ask them what to do and what not to do. They'll be independent of the ISRO, so there'll be no conflict of interest, as I said, between a player and an umpire. And it'll just bring in more clarity and efficiency into the space framework as more and more players enter into the system.
So it will basically clear regulatory hurdles and enable pathways for some of the private sector companies, startups to play a role. For example, if there is a company which wants to launch its constellation of remote sensing satellites, so it would be much easier for them to do with this framework than it is now. What do they have to do now? At present, what are the rules like?
So right now they have to go to ISRO and ask for permissions. So for example, when Cartosat 3 was launched on November 27th on a PSLV C-47, I think there were 13 other satellites, US satellites, which were launched alongside the Cartosat 3. So all these companies whose rockets were launched had to go through Antrix or the New Space India Limited company, which is the commercial arm of ISRO, and ask them to launch their satellites. So what we are saying is we'll also carve out another commercial entity of ISRO called Bharat Space Corporation, which will be responsible for managing all the legacy technologies of ISRO. So basically, in this example as well, Cartosat was the most advanced remote sensing satellite that India has built. This was the frontier technology that ISRO had worked on. But launching it into space on PSLV was not something new. This was done on legacy technology, and ISRO has been doing this for a very long time. This would be done by the new commercial entity with a profit motive. They'll say that they have, say, 15 slots on the satellite. Whoever wants to launch their satellites can come to them, pay certain money, and get their satellites launched. As simple as that. And they'll keep the profits of it. So it will be a for-profit entity working on the legacy technologies of ISRO, be it launch vehicles or be it commercial be it remote sensing satellites or communication satellites. And this private entity would actually be able to design its own plans of, say, whether it wants to launch 20 satellites, whether it wants to build 15 Earth imaging satellites, whether it wants to, say, have a navigation satellite. These are the priorities that this organization would decide on the basis of whether they can turn a profit in this or not.
So I think more broadly, the new regulatory framework will attract foreign companies to launch in India. And here's why, right? Suppose an Indian launch service that is attracting foreign players. And the problem with space currently is that the launch service is shared by many companies. Suppose one of the foreign satellite companies says that, hey, look, my satellite was not launched in the correct orbit. I need justice. I need compensation because my satellite has to be in the correct orbit to function. They can go to the appellate board and get justice. This is not something which is very easy to do right now in any country, right? Getting justice because your satellite was launched in the wrong orbit. So in that sense, India will become a very attractive market for satellite companies across the world to operate in the country because first, there is some guarantee of liability. And second, there is some form of insurance that your money will be spent worthwhile and it will be spent judiciously.
So it will attract foreign players and it will help Indian companies who might, let's say if there's a launch company which is an Indian company, right? And there might be foreign companies which want to launch their satellite. So they can then use the Indian private company for doing this launch, because launch slots are the critical bottleneck in this sector, right? And we can change that if we have more companies. And we are not even talking of things which will be 5 or 10 years down the line. There are already Indian companies which are doing that, right? Utkarsh, can you just give us an overview of some of the Indian companies, what kind of work they are doing, because I think it will be valuable for our listeners to know.
So Astrom is building communication satellites, right, so that it can provide internet connectivity to the remote parts of the country. Rocketeers is building small rockets, I think, for scientific purposes.
Yeah, those are Rocketeers currently, that's for educational
purposes.
Not for launching.
Astrogate.
And then there is there is Skyroot, right?
Skyroot
which is doing. So they have already developed their own launch vehicle, and that launch vehicle basically will be able to get you to the polar orbit, right?
Yeah.
That's and maybe in 1 or 2 years it will be a reality. So we will have an equivalent to something what PSLV does currently for ISRO. There might be another launch vehicle. Then there's Pexels as well, right?
Pixel is doing something on Earth imaging satellites. So they are building satellites, and they'll be using that data to provide value-added SaaS products, space as a service products to companies. Say these products can be used for mapping agriculture over a period of time, mapping forest fires, grazing on the land, disaster management and stuff like that.
Right. So basically, they'll be creating a constellation of imaging satellites, which will provide all these services to people, right? So that's quite exciting stuff, right? There are a lot of things which are happening in this sector, even in India, in spite of the current regulatory uncertainty. So what will happen if we don't have this new space, whatever the bill that you're talking about? What's the alternative? The government, I believe, has something called the New Space Activities Bill, right?
It's actually called the Space Activities Bill 2017. Now it has lapsed because more than 2 years have passed. So some of the major problems with this was it provided an umbrella sort of regulation and said all space activities had a very broad definition, and this is how they will be regulated. So there was no specific space-based activities distinction. So for example, somebody who launches a satellite versus somebody who uses Earth imaging satellites and adds value and sells it to downstream customers have very different risk profiles and financial considerations, and they should be regulated very differently, right? So this is not what the space activities.
So broadly what you're saying, if you are going to be a launch vehicle company, obviously you will have to follow many more rules, laws, etc. But if you just want to use the satellite imagery, the restrictions on you should be much lesser. And you're saying this bill didn't do all these things.
So basically, say somebody who wants to launch a manned space flight in the future. This is not very futuristic. In fact, I think Virgin's founder is planning to do that, right? So if somebody wants to do that, they'll obviously have to go through much stricter regulation because there's human life involved and there is a much higher risk involved in this activity as compared to using images of a satellite, right? So what we have tried to do is build specific regulations for specific space activities and try to define which organization needs to build guidelines and rules for these specific activities. A policy would give a broad framework of what organizations have to be established and what are their major functions. And these organizations, basically SRAI and SAT, will give specific rules and regulations according to the space activities which need to be followed. So what this does is not every small change has to go through a parliament sanction. These independent established bodies would be able to write sub-legislation keeping in mind the changing nature of activities in the space sector, which is very dynamic.
So what did the Space Activities Bill do? It didn't do all these things?
No, it did not talk about specific space-based activities. And as I said, the space activities was a very broad definition. Everything and anything was covered. So it was not clear who is liable for what is their responsibility, how they should go about it and stuff like that. It said that this activity would be licensed and regulated by the Indian government. There was no nodal body appointed for it. So there was no clarity in the sense that who is responsible for giving me the license and who am I accountable to and who should I go to if I have a problem.
Right. But does it actually delineate the various things that ISRO is doing? The activities bill, like for example, what you were proposing was that ISRO should be done into multiple separate organizations because they are doing many things at the same time. Does the space activities bill imagine that?
No, it does not. In fact, it just talks about all the activities and it says India should be a leader and ISRO is the body that is doing it all.
So institutionally, it still retains the status quo where ISRO is the regulator and the player and the service provider and the compliance agency and all that, right? So that is, I think, the major problem with the space activities bill, because it doesn't reimagine the institutional structure, which is critical for enabling
and does not specifically look into different types of space activities, which are very different.
Right.
I think just broadly going back to what will be the implications of not having a new regulatory framework is that India will simply lose out in this new space race because you will have so many suppliers, you will have a lot of demand which is captured by these suppliers, that Indian companies will just not have the space to operate in the way the other foreign companies operate, because they have a first mover advantage where they've got to innovate much more and they've got to think through some of these issues. And if we don't have a new space policy in the next year or so, India will be left way back in the new space race.
Yeah, I think more tangibly, we should look at space as a means to help us get to prosperity, right? There will be new companies making money, and also the demand side of it. We might be able to have new applications which weren't possible before. So what happens with this is basically, if the regulatory environment doesn't enable us to do that, two things happen. One, fewer companies will start. At the margin, a person, if they are thinking whether I should start a space-based startup, they won't go into this because of the regulatory confusion. Second, the people who are already there will just move out of India, right? It's not it's quite mobile, this area, right? So there are companies which can easily have their base in other countries where the regulatory environment is more supportive of them. So we'll just lose them out, right?
In fact, I would point out there'll be some second order effects as well, because a lot of government schemes like Digital India, digital payments, all these rely on fast internet connectivity. And for internet connectivity and telecommunications, putting satellites into space is the easiest way now. So if this does not happen, not only will the private sector move out, India as government will also not be able to implement its schemes like smart cities and Digital India effectively as well as they want to.
Fine. So basically what we discussed today is that we are in the new space age, right? Yeah. And it is characterized by a large participation of the private sector, and if we want to take advantage of that in India, we need to do a bunch of regulatory institutional changes. Otherwise we'll lose out on that. And as I say, we will have to make another Swades movie later and then ask Indian scientists to come back to India.
Yeah.
So this is the way, if you want to avoid watching another Shah Rukh Khan movie, we can stop that by having a new space policy which does that. Okay, thanks Utkarsh and Pranav.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. Thank you, HDFC Life, for coming on board. Also, would like to thank Storytel for continuing the long time advertising that they've been doing with us. And if you have a brand and you'd like to advertise with us, please send us an email. We'd love to talk to you. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On What Up Players, Siddhartha and Mikhail talk about the India-Australia series and discuss who's better between Virat Kohli and Steve Smith. On States of Anarchy, Hamsini is joined by Vineet Hegde to discuss the crisis and dispute mechanisms at the World Trade Organization. On Simplified Shorties, Chuck, Narain and Shriketh welcome their new co-host, Tony Sebastian. On Advertising is Dead, Varun talks to film critic Sucharita Tyagi, known for the popular Not a Review film series on Film Companion. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritasha asks Ayushi 36 questions. Udipan Sarma joins Zarina on the Empowering series. He's the lead singer of the band as we keep searching. Thanks and keep listening.
Welcome to Peak Planet, a new podcast where we delve into the fallouts of the growth path that we and indeed much of the world has chosen. Sustainable growth is the buzzword. Until we nail that down, we need to ensure that we keep our population healthy and also have the resources for our increasingly urban lifestyles. I'm Karthik Ganesan, a researcher at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, a Delhi-based policy research institute where for almost a decade we've been trying to explain and change the use, reuse and misuse of our resources. In the first season of Peak Planet, we take up air pollution, public enemy number one and an invisible one at that. Increasingly, the most important risk factor for adverse health outcomes, air pollution has become the most unwanted byproduct for an aggressively growing economy. Over 4 episodes, we find out how prepared our systems are to deal with this crisis. You can catch the entire first season of Peak Planet out now on the IVM Podcasts app or website or wherever you get your podcast from.